Haven't you ever wondered what else is out there? There's wonders in this world beyond our wandering. I can feel it.
Welcome back, everyone. This will be my Lord of the Rings Super Bowl trailer video for the Rings of Power TV show that's starting later this year. As the title implies, it'll cover how Sauron created the Rings of Power, or tricked the races of Middle-earth into creating the Rings of Power and the One Ring. It's going to take place much earlier in the timeline, thousands of years before the events of the movies, so I'll explain who everyone is and what the plot is, and what Amazon is changing from the books to sort of compress thousands of years of history into like 10 seasons of a show. There's a bunch of Easter eggs, a bunch of familiar characters. Even though some of the actors are different, some of the characters are the same characters that show up during the movies. So we'll break it all down. I'll be doing episode videos for it when it premieres in September, so be sure to subscribe to get everything. When the episodes get here too, I'll do special Lord of the Rings giveaways, Amazon Prime memberships when it starts. But this first teaser trailer is just meant to show you a quick look at most, but not all, of the major characters. As far as I can tell, Sauron is not featured anywhere in any of this footage. He was called Anatar during this period of the timeline. I'll get into that in a second. But there was a lot of confusion when they dropped the trailer because some of the characters that they've announced for the series were alive during very different parts of the timeline during the Second Age when this takes place. So the actual Second Age of Middle-earth covers thousands of years of history, but because they're covering pretty much all the major events of the Second Age during the TV show, they have to compress a lot of that. So there's a lot of characters that were alive during different parts of the timeline that will overlap on the show. But if you're wondering why you don't see Sauron with the One Ring of Power in this trailer, at this point in the timeline where the show picks up, he hasn't created it yet or the other Rings of Power. There were 19 rings plus the One Ring for 20 rings of power total. That is a lot of power. For the most part, the look, the tone that they're going for with the series will feel very similar to the Lord of the Rings movies. Special effects have gotten better the last several years since the Hobbit movies happened, since the original Lord of the Rings movies. Howard Shore is also coming back to work on the music with Bear McCreary, so the music, the soundtrack, will also sound similar to the movies. And even though Amazon only has the TV rights for the Lord of the Rings stuff during the Second Age, they don't have the rights to do any of the movie stuff yet. The people who do own the movie rights are actually putting them up for sale real soon, so Amazon might get those too and start doing more Lord of the Rings movies in the future. So if you're a huge Tolkien fan, big fan of the Lord of the Rings, you're going to be eating good for the next 20 years or so. But as I said, the series takes place during the Second Age, about 2,000 years before the events of the movies. Actually, I think it's a little bit more than that. It's many thousands of years. The reason why there are so many characters from the movies like Galadriel and Elrond on the series, these characters here, is because elves are functionally immortal. So some of the characters will be similar to the ones in the movies, but for example, Gandalf will not be a character during this series because during this part of the timeline, the wizards had not been sent to Middle-earth yet.
A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Gandalf and the group of wizards that he was a part of didn't come to Middle-earth till about 1,000 years into the Third Age. A long, long time after all the stuff that they're going to be covering on the show. Galadriel is one of the main characters on the show. That's why she's featured so heavily in all these different trailer scenes. There's a lot of Galadriel in this footage. Much younger version of the character, played by a different actress, but it is Galadriel. When the plot picks up, she's going to be hunting down Sauron and the remnants of his master Morgoth, Melkor's army, whichever name you want to use for him. He has many different names. Sauron also had many different names. We'll get some of them during the events of this series. Just like we got a prologue at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring that showed the War of the Last Alliance against Sauron where they defeated him, we'll also probably get some kind of prologue scene at the beginning of the series, which will cover the War of Wrath, which was like the last big war at the end of the First Age before the Second Age started. The War of Wrath was their war against Melkor, who's kind of like the Lord of the Rings universe version of Lucifer. He was Sauron's master. He was the first person to try and conquer Middle-earth. All the other races teamed up to fight him. They defeated him, banished him to this abyss, this other dimension outside the main Lord of the Rings dimension. Sauron slinks away and then develops his plan to trick the races of men, create the Rings of Power, and then start his war for Middle-earth. The first age ended with the War of Wrath, which was kind of like that era's version of the War of the Ring, the one you saw take place during the movies. The second age, the one that they're covering during the show, ended with Isildur basically cutting the One Ring off of Sauron's hand with the Shard of Narsil. What Amazon is doing is condensing the second age timeline, like I said, thousands of years of history into several seasons of the show, so I believe their plan is to end the show, like whatever the final season winds up being, with the War of the Last Alliance, the war that you see in the prologue of the Fellowship where they actually defeat Sauron. There was a war before that called the War of Elves and Sauron, which took place earlier in the timeline, which they might merge with the War of the Last Alliance if they're condensing everything. There were a couple wars that they fought with Sauron when he was creating the Rings of Power. But I think that's going to be like their Game of Thrones, War for the Dawn type of event that they build up to, Sauron being their version of the Night King. But the big difference is that unlike the Night King on Game of Thrones, the White Walkers, during this era of the Lord of the Rings timeline, Sauron was hiding in plain sight amongst the races of Middle-earth. The elves, the dwarves, nobody knew that it was Sauron. Because after Sauron's master, Melkor Morgoth, was defeated, banished to the void, Sauron still looked like this, like pretty boy Sauron. His armor didn't look all scary and hardcore till the War of the Last Alliance. He slinked away, used his magic to change his appearance and start using the name Anatar. He presented himself to Celebrimbor, this legendary elf who was the last of this really special group of elves, the super long tragic backstory that's too long for this video. He comes to Celebrimbor pretending to be this Anatar character, pretending to be an emissary of the Ainur with the promise of these Rings of Power meant to give all these races much more power. The Ainur were these primordial cosmic beings that wielded god-tier power and shaped Middle-earth, created the different races, animals, plants, everything. To make biblical references, they're kind of like the different castes of angels, like there are higher choirs of angels, angels that are more powerful than others like archangels. Fun fact too, Sauron and Gandalf come from the exact same subgroup of these primordial beings. They were called Maer. They're like a lesser group of angels within these different tiers of angels. But within their subgroup, Sauron was more powerful than Gandalf. When they're on Middle-earth, they're really just like these angelic beings taking human form. They just go back to their original form if their human bodies get killed. That's why Sauron doesn't completely die when Isildur cuts the ring off his hand. His spirit survives. It's the same thing with Gandalf. Remember, they come from the same group of these primordial beings, so that's how Gandalf can also come back to life, so to speak, take another human form in present day during the events of the movies, just like Sauron comes back. And even though a lot of people think of Sauron as like the end-all, be-all of evil on Middle-earth, the movies kind of portray him that way. The characters talk about him as if he is the ultimate evil. His master, Melkor, was from a way higher caste of even more powerful primordial beings. Melkor, like I said, was kind of like the Lord of the Rings universe version of Lucifer. He was one of the original angelic primordial beings created by the god of the Lord of the Rings universe. Sauron, Gandalf, all the other lesser primordial beings with all this god-tier power didn't really come along till later. So when the episodes pick up, this major war of wrath against Melkor, Sauron, their forces has just been won, but their forces scattered to the four winds. Sauron's still alive, so Galadriel takes it on herself to hunt them down. The character here on the raft who helps save her is a human character named Halbrand. He's not from the books, he's like a new character they created for the show who just winds up helping Galadriel hunt down Sauron. During all the trailer footage, all these scenes of Galadriel that you see with her having adventures, going all over the place, all these action scenes, are during various stages of her hunt to find Sauron. This is the young version of Elrond on the series. The actor might look familiar. He also played young Ned Stark during Game of Thrones. During the events of this series, in this part of the timeline of Middle-earth, Elrond's main mission is to repair diplomatic relations between the elves and the dwarves of Khazad. We visited Khazad during the Fellowship of the Ring after it had been taken over by the Balrog and the orcs much later in the timeline. But during this era, Khazad was still thriving and being ruled over by Durin III. This is Durin IV during the show. He's one of the main characters. He's just a prince when the plot picks up. This female character sitting on the dwarven throne is Princess Disa. She's also not somebody from the book. She's like a new dwarven princess they created for the show. This female character is the show's version of a hobbit. She's a Harfoot. There were no actual hobbits during this part of the timeline in the Second Age. They didn't show up till the Third Age. The race that they evolved from was called the Harfoots. but during these episodes, you can think of her as the show's version of a Hobbit. There's also this really big mystery character that they've been hyping up. During this scene with all the fire, you see her reaching her hand out, the Harfoot reaching her hand out to grab this older man's hand, this shaggy beard. They haven't said who he is, only that he's got this really big, mysterious backstory, and his origin will be a big storyline on the show. For those of you that are thinking of Gandalf theories, like anytime you see an old man with a giant beard with a mysterious backstory, you think of Gandalf. I don't expect him to be Gandalf. Like I said, Gandalf didn't come to Middle-earth till like thousands of years later in the timeline. But if they're compressing the timeline, they could always bend over backwards to get some kind of wizard onto the show. Because it would be weird to see a giant TV show go on for 10 years without any wizards of any kind. This elf here is Gil-galad. He's the High King of all the elves of Middle-earth. Now, there are different groups of elves, different clans that descend from different lines, but he was viewed as the highest authority over all of them during this part of the timeline. The city that he rules from is called Lindon, this area where the scene is taking place. The waterfront city at the beginning of the trailer, as a lot of you might have guessed, is Numenor. This is a real huge deal because during the Second Age, the Numenorians got into that big war with the Valar when Sauron tricked them, quote unquote. This is a familiar theme, Sauron tricking people into their own downfall. He tricked the Numenorians into invading the Undying Lands, and Iluvatar, the true god of the Lord of the Rings universe, basically just plucked the Undying Lands, separating it from the rest of the planet, causing this massive shift in the geography, this giant tidal waves, sinking the entire island of Numenor. That's what they call the downfall of Numenor. Maybe they'll cover that on the show. It's such a huge event, I don't see how they could not do it on the show at some point. The line of kings of Numenor did survive because, in present day, in the timeline of the movies, Aragorn is the last descendant of the original Numenorian kings. Bringing things back around to Elrond and the other characters on the show, there's a lot of connections here too because of the way elves live for so long. The reason why Aragorn lives for so long, why Numenorians in general live for so long, is because they all have elven blood in their veins to various degrees. Numenor, the kingdom, was created by Elrond's brother, Elros. He was the first king of Numenor. Even though elves can basically be functionally immortal, Elrond's brother chose to die after about 400 years, but if they're compressing the timeline, maybe we'll see him create Numenor in flashbacks. I think in present day, because they probably want to do the downfall of Numenor, the main king of Numenor at the time will be the king who presided over the downfall of Numenor. His name was Ar-Pharazôn. There are a couple other lesser characters during the trailer. I'll talk more about them when we get our next trailer with a bunch more footage. Like I said, this trailer just mostly meant to give you a general vibe for the series, give you a sense for when the episodes take place in the timeline, and the really fan-favorite familiar characters like Galadriel and Elrond. What they'll probably do, though, is they'll probably save the big Sauron Anatar reveal, whatever he's going to look like on the show, for much later, like when we get closer to the series actually coming out. If you ever watched the Daredevil Netflix series, they didn't actually reveal the Kingpin character. You didn't actually see him on screen till a little bit later in the episodes. It'll probably be the same thing with Sauron during the Lord of the Rings TV series. But if you spotted any huge Easter eggs that I didn't talk about in the video that you have questions about or anything, just write them below in the comments. Everyone click here for my new Marvel Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness trailer video from the Super Bowl, and click here for my brand new Moon Knight trailer video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.